It was an ordinary morning, and the cabin of the flight was filled with the soft hum of conversations and the rustling of seat belts being fastened. Passengers settled into their seats, some lost in their thoughts, others checking their phones one last time before takeoff. Among the crowd, there was a man sitting comfortably in first class, sipping on a glass of sparkling water, his legs stretched out in front of him. He was the kind of person who carried an air of confidence wherever he went, always certain that he was the smartest person in the room. He glanced around, scanning the passengers seated in business and economy class. His eyes eventually landed on a woman who had just walked down the aisle toward first class. She was dressed in a simple outfit, nothing extravagant, just a plain blouse and jeans. Her hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and she walked with a quiet, unassuming confidence. Nothing about her stood out, except for the fact that she had made her way up to first class. To the man, this seemed out of place. First class, to him, was a space reserved for the wealthy, the powerful, or at least those who had the status to deserve such luxury. But this woman, she didn't fit the mold. He watched as she slowly made her way to her seat, settling down without any fanfare. She didn't seem to notice anyone or anything around her, and to him, that only made her presence seem even more awkward. He turned to his seatmate, a man who had been quietly reading a book, and leaned in with a smug grin. His voice was low but clearly audible, meant to make sure the woman couldn't hear his words. "Look at this," he said, gesturing subtly toward her with his eyes. "What is she doing up here in first class? I mean, she doesn't even look like she belongs here." His seatmate glanced over, raising an eyebrow in curiosity, but said nothing. The man, emboldened by the silence, continued with his whispering commentary. "She's probably one of those people who used points or some sort of special offer to get a seat. No way someone like her could afford to be up here." His laugh was soft, but clearly filled with judgment. "I mean, look at her. No designer clothes, no flashy jewelry. Just plain." The man sat back in his seat, feeling the rush of superiority that came with making someone else the object of ridicule. He had always thought of himself as better than most people, and today he was feeling especially proud of his smart observation. As he looked around the cabin, it was clear to him that no one else seemed to notice or care about the woman. She sat in her seat, staring out the window, seemingly lost in thought, not at all bothered by the whispers and stares. But the more the man stared at her, the more certain he became that she didn't belong. He leaned in closer to his seatmate, eager to continue his judgment. "You know, it's people like her who make first class lose its charm. It's not about the seat. It's about the experience. It's about having someone who knows how to appreciate the luxury. But her, she doesn't get it." His seatmate, clearly uncomfortable now, nodded awkwardly, unsure of how to respond. He shifted in his seat, wanting to avoid the conversation altogether, but the man wasn't finished. He looked around once more, ensuring no one else was paying attention, and continued his quiet ridicule. "I just don't get it," he muttered. "People like her always seem to find a way into the best spots, and it's the ones who work hard and deserve it who get left behind." He shook his head, convinced he was the only one who saw things clearly. As the flight began to taxi down the runway, the man's smug expression didn't waver. He felt in control of the situation, convinced that he had made a keen observation that no one else had caught on to. He thought the woman didn't belong here, that she was simply some lucky person who had found her way into a seat she didn't deserve. But as the plane lifted into the sky, the woman remained calm and composed. She didn't react to the whispers. She didn't look around in embarrassment or frustration. Instead, she stared out the window, lost in her own world, completely unaware of the judgment being passed on her by the man in first class. The tension in the air was palpable, as the man's mocking continued in hushed tones, growing more and more certain of his beliefs. What he didn't know, however, was that this woman wasn't just some ordinary person. He had no idea who she truly was. And soon, he would find out in a way that would leave him speechless. As the plane soared higher into the sky, The gentle hum of the engines filled the cabin, and the rhythm of the flight became a comforting backdrop to the ongoing tension. The man, feeling more and more smug by the second, leaned back in his plush first-class seat, a satisfied grin on his face. His eyes darted toward the woman seated a few rows ahead, still looking calm and composed as if nothing had happened. Her calmness only seemed to fuel his sense of superiority. How could she be so unaffected by his comments? Didn't she feel the sting of being looked down upon? The more he watched her, the more certain he became that she didn't belong in first class. He couldn't help but keep glancing at her, wondering how someone who looked so ordinary could sit in a seat that was reserved for the elite. His thoughts were interrupted when the flight attendants began their in-flight service. As they moved down the aisle, the man looked around at the lavishness of first class, the rich leather seats, the elegant meals, and the attentive service. He allowed himself to bask in the luxury of it all. He couldn't help but feel a little proud of himself for being someone who truly appreciated the finer things in life. But even in the midst of all this, his attention kept drifting back to the woman who was, in his mind, an intruder to this exclusive space. And still, she sat there, so quiet, so still, like she was in her own world, unaffected by the whispers or the stares. She had a slight smile on her face as she gazed out the window, her thoughts seemingly far away. The man couldn't understand it. How could she sit there so calmly, as if nothing was out of the ordinary? With a growing sense of disbelief, he leaned over to his seatmate again. His voice was softer this time, but still full of judgment. "Look at her," he whispered, nodding toward the woman, who was still oblivious to the attention she was receiving. "She doesn't belong here. I mean, it's one thing if you're rich and want to show it off, but to just act like it's no big deal. She doesn't even look like she knows how to appreciate what she has." He paused, shaking his head with a hint of frustration. "I bet she's just trying to look calm, but she has no idea how out of place she really is." His seatmate, who had been trying to avoid the conversation, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly not wanting to engage. But the man was on a roll, unable to stop himself now. His words had become more pointed, more venomous. "If she's in first class, she probably doesn't even appreciate what it means to have money or power," he continued, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "She probably doesn't even know how to have a real conversation with someone who has any substance. People like her." He glanced at the woman again. "They don't understand what it's like to earn something. They just get handed things." The man paused, convinced that his observations were spot on. But then something strange happened. The flight attendants, who had finished serving the other passengers, began to move toward the woman. The man watched curiously as one of the attendants knelt down beside her with a polite smile. "Excuse me, Miss Bondi," the flight attendant said warmly. "We have your meal prepared. Is there anything else I can assist you with?" The woman nodded with a soft smile, but to the man's surprise, she didn't look at all flustered by the attention. Instead, she seemed to be completely at ease. The name Bondi didn't immediately ring a bell, but the man couldn't help but notice the respectful tone of the flight attendants and the way they treated her. He leaned in closer to his seatmate once again, his curiosity piqued. "Did she just say her name was Bondi?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who is she? I've never heard of anyone in first class being treated like that." The seatmate shrugged, clearly not interested in continuing the conversation. But the man's thoughts were racing. Who could this woman be? Her name sounded familiar now that he thought about it, but he couldn't place it. Perhaps she was someone important. Maybe she was a celebrity or a well-known figure, but he hadn't recognized her. He felt a small pang of embarrassment. Was it possible that this woman, whom he had mocked so freely, was someone significant? The more he thought about it, the more uneasy he became. He decided to keep his eyes on her, trying to figure out why the flight attendants treated her with such respect. There was something about her that was different from the ordinary people he usually saw in first class. But what was it? The plane hummed steadily as it cruised at high altitude. Most passengers had settled into their own quiet worlds, some reading, others closing their eyes for a nap. The man, however, could not relax. His thoughts kept racing, fixated on the woman sitting just a few rows ahead of him. Every few minutes, he would glance over at her, still trying to piece together who she really was. The name Bondi stuck in his mind, and for some reason, it bothered him that he couldn't place it. His curiosity began to gnaw at him. Why had the flight attendants been so polite to her? Why did they address her with such respect? He wasn't used to seeing someone in first class treated like this. Surely, she wasn't just some random passenger. But who was she? His thoughts were interrupted when the woman shifted in her seat. She reached into her bag, pulling out a folder. The man watched, his eyes narrowing, as she opened it. There, in the soft glow of the reading light above her, he caught a glimpse of a few documents. His heart skipped a beat as he saw a familiar name at the top of one of the papers. Pam Bondi. Suddenly, it clicked. The name from earlier was not just some coincidence. Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida. He felt a wave of shock rush over him as he processed the realization. She wasn't just a regular passenger. She was someone powerful, someone well known in political circles. The man sat there frozen, his eyes widening as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. He had been mocking Pam Bondi, someone who had been in the spotlight for years. How could he have been so blind? How had he not recognized her sooner? His mind raced with questions. What if she had heard his comments? What if she knew what he had been saying? His face flushed with embarrassment as he imagined how foolish he must look. He had ridiculed a woman with a name that carried weight, not just in politics, but across the country. A wave of guilt washed over him. He had made fun of her for being ordinary, when in fact, she was far from it. He had assumed that her simple clothes and calm demeanor meant she didn't belong in first class, but in reality, she was someone who had achieved greatness, someone who had worked tirelessly for her position. He felt small, petty, and utterly embarrassed. Just then, the flight attendants returned to Pam's row. One of them leaned down and spoke to her in a tone that was clearly meant for someone important. "Ms. Bondi, would you like anything else? We have a selection of desserts for you, if you'd like." Pam smiled warmly, her voice calm and composed. "Thank you, but I'm good for now," she said softly, her gaze flicking briefly toward the man who had been mocking her just moments ago. The man's heart skipped. Was that a knowing glance? Did she know he had been talking about her? He swallowed hard, his throat dry. There was no way she could have heard everything, right? Or could she have? He had been so loud, so confident in his judgment, thinking that no one would ever suspect who she really was. His stomach churned with a sense of dread. The thought of having mocked Pam Bondi, one of the most influential figures in politics, was beginning to sink in. He couldn't decide what was worse, the possibility that she knew what he had said, or the fact that he had been too blind to recognize her in the first place. The woman, now fully aware that the man had figured out who she was, went back to her folder, her calm demeanor unshaken. She didn't look at him again. She didn't say anything. She just returned to her reading, as if nothing had happened. But for the man, it wasn't that simple. The realization of who she was had shattered his sense of superiority. His mind kept replaying his earlier comments, the way he had so confidently belittled her, and the more he thought about it, the worse it became. His jaw tightened, and he could feel his face burning with humiliation. What had he done? Was it too late to apologize? Would Pam even care? Or had his careless words already sealed his fate? As the flight continued, the man couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. He had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was for sure. Pam Bondi was not someone he could easily forget. The truth had been revealed, and he now had to face the consequences of his actions. As the minutes passed, the unease inside the man continued to build. He couldn't stop replaying the conversation in his mind. The mocking comments, the smug laughs, The way he had so confidently assumed the woman in first class didn't belong. Now that he knew who she really was, the weight of his actions felt like a crushing burden. He had ridiculed a woman with such power and influence, and worse yet, he hadn't even realized who she was until it was too late. He tried to distract himself by looking out the window, but all he could think about was the woman sitting just a few rows ahead of him. Pam Bondi. His stomach churned as the reality of the situation sank in deeper. He had no idea how to fix this, no way to take back his words. There was no magic way to undo the hurt he might have caused. All he could do now was wait and hope that somehow she hadn't overheard his comments, or worse, that she hadn't already made a judgment about him. He looked over at his seatmate, who had noticed his growing discomfort. The man tried to strike up a conversation, hoping to distract himself from the gnawing sense of guilt. "Can you believe this?" he muttered, trying to keep his voice light. "I didn't even realize who she was until just now. Pam Bondi. Can you imagine? Here I was, making fun of her like she was just some regular passenger." His seatmate looked up, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. "You didn't know?" he asked cautiously. "I mean, she's a pretty well-known public figure." The man groaned, rubbing his temples. "I feel like such an idiot," he admitted, his voice filled with self-loathing. "I was so sure she didn't belong in first class. I made fun of her clothes, her calm demeanor. I mocked her for looking so ordinary. And now I realize who she is, and I can't stop thinking about how bad I must look." His seatmate shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. The man sighed deeply, his mind racing with thoughts of how he could possibly make this right. Would an apology be enough? Would she even care? Was he simply too late to do anything about it? As the flight continued, the man tried his best to act normal, but his mind kept returning to Pam. He looked at her once again, still seated calmly in her spot. She didn't look angry. She didn't look upset. She didn't seem to care at all about the whispers and mockery he had made. To him, this was even more unsettling. Why wasn't she reacting? How could she sit there with such quiet composure, knowing what he had said? His discomfort grew when he saw her glance down at her watch, then reach for her phone, typing something quickly. Was she texting someone? Or perhaps she was making a note to report the obnoxious passenger in first class. The thought made his blood run cold. He could already imagine the headlines. "Arrogant passenger mocks politician in first class." His anxiety continued to spiral as he debated what, if anything, he could do to salvage this situation. The longer he sat there, the more he began to regret his actions. The plane's hum faded into the background as he wrestled with the idea that he might have just made a powerful enemy. He had seen politicians before, people who had a reputation for holding grudges, for getting back at anyone who wronged them, and now he had unknowingly targeted one of them. His hands began to sweat. What if Pam Bondi decided to confront him? What if she confronted the entire plane? He tried to picture how that would go. Would she scold him publicly? Would she call them out in front of everyone and make him look even more foolish than he already did? His thoughts spiraled into a frenzy as he considered the worst-case scenario. It was then that he realized, no matter how much he tried to justify it, the damage was already done. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. He couldn't simply forget about it. This was more than just an embarrassing moment. He had mocked someone who was far beyond his reach, someone with the kind of power and status that could change his life forever. Whether she chose to confront him or not, the guilt was something he would carry with him for a long time. But what could he do? Could he apologize? Would she accept his apology, or would it be seen as insincere? The man felt helpless, trapped in his own thoughts, as the minutes ticked by. All he knew for sure was that he had learned a valuable lesson the hard way. Never judge someone based on their appearance, never underestimate the people around you, and certainly never assume that anyone doesn't deserve a place in first class or any other part of life. The flight continued, the hours ticking by slowly, and with each passing moment, The man felt the weight of his earlier actions pressing harder on him. The thought of his mockery, the assumption he had made about Pam Bondi, each time it crossed his mind, he sank deeper into the pit of regret. He had tried to distract himself, to think about something else, but every glance toward the woman in first class only intensified his guilt. Pam, however, remained as calm and composed as ever. She hadn't reacted to the whispers, hadn't shown any sign of discomfort, and to the man, that made everything even worse. It felt like she wasn't even acknowledging him, like he didn't exist in her world at all. Perhaps in her eyes, he was just another insignificant person, someone not even worth the trouble of a confrontation. As the flight entered its final phase, the tension on board seemed to rise. The man sat nervously, occasionally glancing at his watch, wondering if the end of the flight meant the end of his chance to do something, anything, to redeem himself. He couldn't shake the feeling that something might happen soon, something that would force him to confront his actions head-on. His anxiety grew as the plane prepared to descend. At that moment, the flight attendants began preparing the cabin for landing, moving briskly down the aisles. The man's nerves were on edge as he noticed Pam Bondi stand up and begin gathering her things. She was still so poised, so composed, it was as if the whole world was at peace for her. He, on the other hand, felt like a mess, his stomach in knots. He watched her walk down the aisle toward the front of the plane, and as she passed by, something unexpected happened. She paused for a moment, stopping right next to his seat. For the briefest second, the man thought his heart might stop. Could this be the moment? Was she going to say something? Was she going to confront him about his behavior? He couldn't even breathe, his eyes wide as he looked up at her. His mind raced through 1,000 possible ways she could address him, each one worse than the last. His palms began to sweat, and his heart hammered in his chest. He half expected her to speak harshly, to call him out for his rude comments, or maybe even to shame him in front of everyone. He had already made a fool of himself, but this could be the final blow. But to his surprise, Pam didn't scold him. She didn't even seem angry. She simply turned toward him, her expression serene, her eyes meeting his. And then, almost as if she had read his mind, she spoke in a calm, soft voice that cut through the tension like a knife. "Good luck with everything," she said, her words just barely audible, but carrying a sense of warmth that the man had not expected. There was no bitterness, no sarcasm, just a quiet kindness. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had spent the entire flight dreading a confrontation, worrying about what he might say, what she might say. But instead of retribution, he was met with something completely different. Pam gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile before she continued walking down the aisle, disappearing into the front of the plane. The man sat there, stunned, utterly frozen in place. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to be so graceful, so understanding. For a moment, he simply stared ahead, unable to move. His mind couldn't process what had just happened. Was she being sincere? Did she truly mean it? Or was it all just a polite gesture to avoid confrontation? But no matter the intent behind her words, one thing was clear. Pam Bondi had taken the higher road. She hadn't reacted in anger. She hadn't lashed out. Instead, she had chosen kindness over retribution, leaving him speechless and humbled. As the plane began its descent, the man sat quietly, reflecting on the encounter. He had expected a storm, a confrontation that would make him feel even smaller than he already did. But instead, Pam had handed him an opportunity to learn, to reflect, and to grow from the mistake he had made. His chest tightened as he thought about how easily he had dismissed her, how cruelly he had judged her. He had let his own arrogance blind him to who she really was. But now, with the wisdom of hindsight, he saw just how wrong he had been. The plane touched down smoothly, signaling the end of the journey. The man was still lost in thought, his mind racing through everything that had transpired. The tension that had gripped him for the entire flight now began to dissipate, replaced by a deeper sense of humility. He hadn't expected Pam Bondi to respond the way she did, but her grace had shaken him to his core. And now, as he disembarked from the plane, he knew that this encounter would stay with him long after he had left the airport. The lesson had been learned, and it was a powerful one. Never judge someone based on appearances, and never assume that you know their worth. He had been given a rare opportunity to change, and whether he realized it or not, Pam Bondi had already shown him the way. As the plane touched down and the passengers began to gather their belongings, the man found himself lost in thought. He hadn't moved from his seat immediately, still processing the events that had just unfolded. His mind replayed the moment Pam Bondi had passed by him, her quiet words echoing in his head, "Good luck with everything." The kindness in her tone, the calmness with which she had spoken to him, it had all left him stunned. He had expected confrontation, anger, even disdain, but instead, he had been met with something completely different. The feeling in his chest was a strange mix of guilt, admiration, and even a small sense of awe. As passengers around him started to leave the plane, he gathered his things slowly, not in any rush to exit. He watched as Pam Bondi, composed as ever, walked toward the front of the plane. Her posture was confident, her expression serene, as if none of the previous tension had even existed. The man's eyes followed her until she disappeared from view. It wasn't just her words that had struck him, but the way she carried herself. She had so effortlessly demonstrated grace and dignity in the face of his rude behavior. Where he had expected retaliation, she had offered a lesson in kindness. He finally stood up, his legs feeling heavy, as if the weight of his earlier actions had taken a toll. As he made his way toward the exit, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter had changed something inside him. He had set out that day with the assumption that his status and sense of superiority made him above certain things, and certainly above other people. But now he was questioning everything he had believed. Stepping off the plane, he found himself in a sea of passengers, all hurriedly collecting their luggage or heading toward the exit. The hum of the airport, the bustling voices, and the endless activity felt distant to him now. His thoughts were still fixed on Pam Bondi, on the grace she had shown, and on the way his arrogance had been completely undone in the span of just a few minutes. As he reached for his phone to check his messages, a wave of realization washed over him. He had thought he could simply mock someone without consequence, assuming that people like Pam Bondi wouldn't care about what he had to say. But now he understood. It wasn't about her responding. It was about him changing, about realizing that no one, no matter their position or appearance, deserved to be treated the way he had treated her. His thoughts shifted to his friends and family, to the people he interacted with on a daily basis. How many times had he passed judgment on others without considering the bigger picture? How many times had he assumed that someone didn't deserve the respect he offered others, simply because of how they looked or carried themselves? He realized now that his behavior needed to change, not just toward Pam Bondi, but toward everyone he encountered. Still feeling the weight of his mistake, he made a mental note to himself. Apologize to Pam. Whether she remembered the brief encounter or not, he needed to do what was right. And yet, something told him that the real apology wasn't something that would come with words. It was something that had to start within him. As he walked through the airport, he felt his shoulders relax a little. The journey, though filled with discomfort and humiliation, had led to something valuable. It wasn't about the shame he felt. It was about the change it sparked inside of him. And he knew now, more than ever, that appearances could be deceiving. He had made assumptions based on nothing but his own biases and arrogance, and those assumptions had cost him not just his pride, but an opportunity to learn and grow. He glanced around at the people in the airport, noticing how easy it was to judge them based on their clothing, their mannerisms, or the way they spoke. But now, he was determined to change his perspective. The lesson he had learned that day, from Pam Bondi's silent strength and grace, was far more valuable than anything else he could have gained from his previous judgments. As he left the airport, he found himself looking at the world a little differently. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to everyone than met the eye. Maybe everyone had a story, a journey, a reason for being where they were, and he promised himself that, from now on, he would strive to understand before passing judgment. In the days that followed, he would reflect often on the flight, on the woman who had unknowingly changed his outlook on life. The encounter would stay with him for a long time, not just as a moment of embarrassment, but as a turning point in his own self-awareness. As he moved forward in life, the lesson Pam Bondi had taught him would linger in the back of his mind, always present, always reminding him to treat others with the respect they deserve, regardless of their status or appearance. Days passed, but the man couldn't shake the encounter with Pam Bondi. It wasn't just the shame he had felt in that moment, nor the embarrassment of having mocked someone so influential without realizing who she truly was. No, what really stayed with him was the profound impact of her calmness, her grace under pressure, and her ability to teach him a lesson without even knowing she had done so. As the days turned into weeks, the man began to change. He found himself reflecting on his interactions with others, both big and small. It wasn't just the people he met in high-profile situations, like Pam Bondi, who required respect and kindness. It was everyone. The barista at his favorite coffee shop, the receptionist at his gym, even strangers on the street. He had spent so much of his life judging people based on appearances, dismissing them without even trying to understand their stories. But now his perspective had shifted. He began to see people differently, no longer through the lens of judgment or superiority, but through empathy and curiosity. He noticed the way people smiled at him, the way they spoke to him, and he realized how often he had taken these things for granted. He now understood that every person he met had their own experiences, struggles, and achievements, some of which he would never know just by looking at them. And in the weeks that followed, his newfound mindset began to make a difference in his relationships too. His conversations were deeper, more meaningful, as he listened to others with genuine interest, instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. He found that when he offered kindness and respect, it was returned in ways he hadn't expected. But it wasn't just in his personal life that he felt the change. He had started to feel the ripple effect of his actions. His work life had improved as well. Where he had once taken pride in thinking he was always the smartest or most accomplished in the room, he now understood the value of collaboration, humility, and learning from others. People were more willing to share ideas with him, to work with him, because they felt respected. He was no longer the arrogant man who believed he had all the answers. Now he was someone who truly valued the contributions of everyone around him. The one thing he couldn't shake, though, was Pam Bondi. He never stopped thinking about her. Despite the brief encounter, she had left a mark on him. Every time he caught himself slipping into old habits, judging someone too quickly, he would remember her quiet strength and the grace with which she had handled the situation. He wished, more than anything, that he could apologize to her, truly apologize, not just for his words, but for his entire attitude that had led him to mock her in the first place. But no matter how much he wished for that moment to come, he knew it wasn't likely. He would probably never see Pam Bondi again, and in a way, he was okay with that. The lesson she had given him was far more valuable than any apology could be. He had learned something far more important, about respect, kindness, and never judging a book by its cover. And so, the man moved forward with a new sense of purpose. He no longer saw the world through the narrow lens of his former arrogance. Instead, he saw it through the eyes of someone who had learned that every person has a story to tell, and that story was worth listening to. His heart had softened, his perspective broadened, and he knew that he was becoming a better person for it. One day, while walking down the street, he caught sight of a familiar name on a newsstand. It was an article about Pam Bondi, detailing her career, her achievements, and the incredible work she had done for her community. He paused, staring at the headline. The feeling of regret bubbled up in him again, but this time it was different. Instead of wishing for an apology, he simply smiled to himself, knowing that the lesson had been learned. The encounter with Pam Bondi had changed him, and that change had rippled through every part of his life. As he walked away from the newsstand, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him before. He wasn't perfect. He hadn't erased all of his past mistakes, but he had taken a major step in the right direction. He had been humbled, and in that humility, he had found something valuable: understanding. Understanding that the world wasn't made up of better and worse people, but of individuals who deserved respect, kindness, and compassion. And as for Pam Bondi, she remained a quiet figure in his life, a symbol of grace, strength, and the power of silent wisdom. He would carry the lesson she had unknowingly taught him for the rest of his days.